Okay, we're coming into chapter 10 now in 1 Corinthians, and we're going to see a definite shift in the thought and the point that Paul is making. So he rounded off everything he covered in chapter 9 that was definitely connected and important, but yet served as somewhat of an interruption. In chapter 8, he was dealing with the matters of things offered to idols. And he emphasized at the end of that we need to make sure not to give in to those kind of things and to do everything we can not to cause our brethren to stumble by our participation in something, even if there would be nothing wrong inherently in it, to make sure we don't do something that would be wrong because of what we do in harming a brother. And that led him to the discussion through chapter 9 and talking about the different things he decided to do, and why he did that was all about the benefit for souls and making sure as many people as possible would be saved. And so when we move now into chapter 10, he's going to go back to Israel, which seems a little bit odd in a way, because for the most part, the Corinthians are Gentiles for the most part. Not all, but they're Gentiles. And so that's the predominant feel in their background, the congregation. And so you come to chapter 10, and he's going to recount Israel's history. And you have to ask the question, why? And he is bringing them along in this. And when we recognize this connection in what he's pulling things together, is the whole history of Israel as he goes into it. We're going to look at the introduction this week, and then when we come back, we'll deal with the second part. So the first half of this section, which is really 1 through 11, the first 5 verses are all committed to kind of setting up Israel as God's people and what made them God's people. And then in verses 6 through 11, he's showing where they went wrong as God's people. And specifically, it was they fell into idolatry in different ways. Different aspects of that. There's the theme. Now, when you remember that is the background of the congregation in Corinth for the most part too, idolatry, paganism, and that they came out of that in order to become God's people, which is going to become the point which follows this section, then it makes sense what he's doing. He is taking that section which was related somewhat to idolatry, things offered to idols, has an aside there about the attitude that we should give one another, but now he's coming back to that and saying, despite the fact that you could interact with this some, you need to be careful because you're God's people, and that those pagan practices, if you start bringing those things back, you're going to end up in the same predicament that Israel did. So that's where we're going with this. So I want us to look now here, beginning in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll read verse 1 and we'll see. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. I wanted you to note, and I probably should have read it a little bit different way, but it's important, how many times the word all appeared. He is wanting to show that what was true for Israel, is these were all things that were universally true for Israel. They all were in this situation. So what he's describing now is everyone fell into this category. All went through these same processes. All had these same opportunities. And that's important setup for when he gets to verse 5 and then what happens after that to show that that wasn't a guarantee. Okay? But what we have now is, as we walk through this, if you were listening as you read and said, that seems a little bit odd. What's he doing? You have the use, and it's important to understand the use of figures here. When you're familiar with the actual history, which is he's making all these allusions to his early history. And so as we look at Israel's early history, we're going to be turning back over and looking at, you should always check what actually happened. Because he is making connections there, and you say, well, that's not literally true, it's figuratively true. There is, in the whole idea is you say, because you see this, what is Paul doing with it? He's not just then telling you the history of Israel. He's pulling out certain points and describing them in ways to establish a relationship between the two things, not because they are identical in terms of factual account, but because he's establishing essentially a type and a type kind of approach. By saying, here is something that happened on a physical level, okay, but this now we're talking more on a spiritual level of what he is addressing all of these on. And he's going to, you see that because of the emphasis, not just of all in this text, but spiritual. Okay, so the repeated words help clue you into his purpose and the differences of what he is doing. Whenever you come across anything that has its roots in the Old Testament, then it is important that you go back and take a look so that you recognize what the relationship is. You familiarize yourself with it. So we start then in verse 1. He says, moreover, brethren, and it's interesting, this is a side note, because if your version maybe say 4, and that's just a difference in the text. Slight different understanding, but not much. But he says, moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware. It's Paul's nice way of saying, I want you to know. It's kind of, I'm addressing a problem, but I don't want to say it in that way. I want you to know. I want you to be as so you are someone who is not ignorant. That's a wordy way of saying it. But Paul is emphasizing then, I don't want you in this dangerous situation. This is not just information I'm passing on. I'm giving you essential information that if you do not have it, there's going to be a problem. And I think that's really what you see is why he would choose to do, I do not want you to be unaware, or I do not want you to be ignorant. Okay. So he's saying, okay, when you look at this, say, did they not know about Israel? I mean, this was kind of baseline stuff, wasn't it? Even if you were a Gentile, you had access to Septuagint. That's kind of some of the early stuff you're going to read. So what he's wanting to make sure that they understand is not just the facts of the Exodus. That's not what he's wanting to get across. He's using those facts to make a point that he wants to make sure that they know. Okay? I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud. Now you have to make a decision here. When he says our fathers, we know who he's talking about, right? Okay, I'm looking for some hint of recognition here. Who's he talking about? He's talking about the Jews. Who's his audience that he's writing to? Mostly Gentiles, Jew and Gentile mix. Now when he says our fathers, is he referring to we Jews' fathers, or is he referring to Christians, our fathers? Is he including the Gentile, the Christians in this, or is he stating it as a In other words, is he using this as a cultural reference, or is he using it as a spiritual reference? All of us, our fathers as Christians, our fathers as Jews. That's an interesting hermeneutical principle you just established. Not going to find that in many books, I'll say. So what is the basis of which he's doing this? Probably his overall point about being spiritual. If we're looking ahead, that if that's the case, and he's wanting to emphasize the connection between the two, and that we have an identification with them for the point of the type antitype, then it makes sense that what he's wanting to do is understand these are your fathers too, in a spiritual sense. If we're following through, we're anticipating where the rest of the text is going. Okay? So he says, okay, there are fathers. That indicates some kind of connection and responsibility to understand that, okay, these are our people. Okay, so we have some kind of connection. He's going to establish what that connection is. And he starts by saying, our fathers were under the cloud. Now, what is interesting about the idea of being under the cloud here? Oh, you have to speak up. Okay, and before the wilderness. Okay, it started before the wilderness. How did he lead them in the wilderness? That cloud, right? But we don't call it a cloud typically, and that can throw us off. We're talking about it to be a cloudy pillar. But it was usually referred to as a cloud. When you look in the New Testament, you see this. So it has to do with this is what was leading. Okay, now it says, and the tricky thing for me, though, is under. Because when you go back and you look at this, it's not something that you typically think of as being under. If we turn, let's go back to Exodus 13. Verse 21 and 22. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night before the people. So you have that reference. If you go also to chapter 14, look at verse 19. And the angel of God, who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all that night. And then the next part is where you have the division of the sea. Now, to appreciate what's going on then when he says that you were under the cloud. Okay. I think partially it speaks to both the general sense of what you would have had. It's possible that there's more going on with the Hebrew, not being able to perfectly describe it, that you have this kind of work where you're going, he's moving over them in this sense. That you've got him before them, and then he's got them behind him, and so you've got an action where he's going over them. Okay, that also is very possible where they would have been under it. Also, this is a pillar that's not described. You have a cloud here, but it was a pillar. Well, what's the nature of a pillar? It's high, right? And so in that sense, you're looking up. So I think both are possible, and to understand this about what he is really getting to when you're walking through all this, that you're under the cloud. It's also that you are under the cloud in the sense of protection. Okay, that's the third thing that's important. Because within the text which is mentioned, the whole point is you have the cloud, in which, did you notice this idea of it gave light on the one side and it was still dark on the other? So you've got essentially, it's both at one point. You have fire providing light out over them to show the way as they are going through the Red Sea. That does not mean, though, that that's what the Egyptians were seeing. They were seeing a fog they couldn't even get through. They couldn't see into. Okay? So you have all that as a way of passage through. So you have him leading the way, traveling, going back, blocking, showing the light, and continuing to block as they go through the Red Sea. And what we have in the next verse there in chapter 14 of Exodus, where Moses raised his hands, and there you have the parting of the Red Sea. Okay, all of that's important when you get down to when he says, "Thou, they were under the cloud," and then the next thing, "all passed through the sea." So you're under that protection of the cloud, and he's introducing this slowly. Okay, and they're going to pass through the sea. So all of these elements, what he's doing is he's tying these actual kind of physical elements that are produced, he's going and giving them, and then he's going to put a spiritual kind of meaning to them. He's not saying that's what it was literally, it's a meaning. Okay, so you have the cloud, now you've got passing through the sea. Now, that's important because it is New Testament verification of what is by modernists a disputed act from the Old Testament. This is what happened, that you have the cloud, the different reference to that. In 14, next verse, they pass through. And it says there, they pass through on dry ground. Okay? So, which is interesting for what comes up next. Okay? So you have that going on. So what's happening? They're passing through. What happened at that moment when they were passing through the Red Sea? Okay, that's going to be coming up in the next verse. That's exactly right. They're saved by that water because it is a barrier. Okay, so we'll go ahead and note that then. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So what does he do in his phrasing? He brings up two elements, connects them. You have the cloud, sits above them, and then on either side is the sea. And so they were baptized. Now this is where we need to understand the way he is arguing. He is putting this, and the word is, it's one of those things, it's a word that is always been, it's been transliterated forever. It's immersed, okay? Submerged, okay? But the whole idea is whether or not you're talking about it being used in a literal way or a figurative way. The idea of when it's used in a figurative way, it's an overwhelming. When it's used in a literal way, it means you are underneath. Okay, talk about actual water, you're submerged under the water. Okay, so baptism always was underwater as a whole. Here, though, that's why he brings together the whole idea of that cloud and the sea, is the whole idea of that they were in an enclosed space. In that same way. Remember, he's creating a figure, right? He's using what happened there, but he's trying to create a figure for our benefit. When he says then, he's tying it to what they understood. We can go all the way back to chapter 1 to the reference of baptism there. He's going to use it again in this chapter. But they were all baptized into Moses. Baptized into Moses. Now, you say, well, that's kind of an odd, how are they baptized into Moses? You're familiar, though, what you should be anticipating of being baptized into Christ, which that appears multiple times in the New Testament. Galatians chapter 3, 27, Romans chapter 6, right? Verse 4, you're baptized into Christ. You are immersed into Christ. Well, what does that mean? Well, with the nature of this preposition, it's the same one as when you're in Acts chapter 2, verse 38, that you are baptized for remission of sins, unto remission of sins, as an end in mind, okay? Here, when it's used, and I want to preface this by saying that the literature is not great on this, but it stands up, what I'm about to tell you stands up as far as its usage. You're introduced to, in that case, you're baptized into this relationship. Now, the relationship is different by being baptized into Moses and being baptized into Christ, because Moses did not do everything for them that Jesus did for us. But it was a relationship nonetheless, and that's where that was sealed, and they entered that relationship at that time. They were following Moses and accepting Moses' leadership as they went through the Red Sea, because that was providing them the way out of Egypt. Now, I want you to note something else here. They had been following the cloudy and fiery pillar before they got to the Red Sea. The journey of looking to God and following God did not begin at the Red Sea, but the relationship in which they ceased to be slaves in Egypt and become their own people as a nation under the leadership of Moses, that does happen on the Red Sea. So what do you have as a idea here presented is that there's a process that he gives of, remember that in the nature of the plagues, he was not simply showing his power to Pharaoh. He was not simply showing his power to the Egyptians. He was proving his power to Moses and the Israelites. He was building their faith so that they would be ready to go. They follow him out, but they're not out. They're ready to leave, but they haven't left. And it's at this point that Paul picks up this part of the journey. It says, here's a decisive point at which they enter this relationship with Moses that is different. Things change, okay? That's the nature of the figure. All of Israel then, they passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So there's your figure. So now you come up in verse 3. All ate the same spiritual food. Okay. Let's go back to Exodus. Chapter 14 is where they cross through the Red Sea. Chapter 15 is where they sing the Song of Moses. Now, these are going to be out of order, and I want you to note that because I think it's important. At the end of chapter 15, there is a problem originally of water. He skips over that one. At that time, he put a tree in it, and the bitter waters became good waters. He's skipping over that one. That doesn't apply in terms of the figure that he's looking toward. But in chapter 16, they're coming down, and this is where you have the whole congregation complained. Verse 3, and the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of the meat, when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." That didn't take long, did it? We're already longing for the old life. Now remember what he's addressing with the Corinthians. He's trying to instill in them and steel them against going back to the old life. Okay? Now, if you go on, you follow all of this, he's going to say in verse 11, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you shall eat meat, in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God." So it was that quail came up at the evening and covered the camp. Okay? Now you've got this, and then the next thing, there was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat." All right. So you've got the same spiritual food. God's providing something. But notice that he said spiritual food. It's not the same food. He didn't provide manna to the Corinthians. Okay? That's not what he did, and he didn't do it in this way. But he's provided something that has a spiritual meaning to it. You look in verse 4, and you come back. I keep going back and forth between all these, so keep your hand there. And all drank the same spiritual drink. Now, actually, those are paired. So it's unfortunate, I think, that those were put in different verses, even though I understand why. Now you get in, and so you've got the whole idea with the provision of manna, which continued until they entered the promised land. But next, you come down to chapter 17. And in chapter 17 of Exodus, the people are once again ready to kill Moses. But then he says in verse 6, "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not?" All right. So what you have back to back is the Lord providing bread, okay, and quail in that instance, and water. So food and drink, okay? And he says, and he calls in each case spiritual. We drink. So the connection he's wanting is not with what they got how, but there's something that God has provided for us that falls within a similar vein. Remember, when we were talking with figures, you're dealing with, he's making some connection between the two in more of a type antitype kind of way. Now he's going to give some explanation at the end of verse 4. "For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." Messiah. Okay, now we understand more what was going on through this whole thing. Is that he has been talking about throughout, he's been labeling them in terms of the spiritual. The leadership of God in the cloud, but combined with the water in the Red Sea going through, baptism. Why? Because that was significant, the event at which you become distinct as God's people. Okay? They entered this relationship with Moses today, and we enter a relationship with Christ at baptism. They had provision of a food and drink that were spiritually provided. Now, in the context of 1 Corinthians and where he's going to be going soon, this likely does not refer so much to the daily provisions so much as the specific ideas of the Lord's Supper, which is communion with God, fellowship with Him. More than likely. It could be that you're talking about provision, though you tend to see that more generically. Here, in what he's doing, he's laying it out as being spiritual kind of things. And because he labels it as being spiritual, okay, baptism is a spiritual kind of thing, that's the labeling. Spiritual food, spiritual drink. So what has a spiritual connotation in our food and drink within the context of the church? The Lord's Supper. What is that? That is something that identifies and recognizes our fellowship with God and what God's done for us. John? I don't... Okay, did you almost know if it's talking about unity? I think that unity would be a benefit, though not the emphasis. He's more wanting, if you look at all of these, he's wanting to establish a stronger sense of identity. Okay, so I think identity more than unity. Unity should come with identity, but they needed, where they were, they needed a sense of, the right kind of sense of identity. An identity of a new life that they began as a God's people. They needed a new identity in terms of those with whom they were in fellowship. And here's where you say unity comes in, of that we identify what holds us together is the meal that we share together. He's going to get to that in chapter 11, because that was a problem for them too. But he's already going to get to it in chapter 10 in some ways, okay? So you come back to this, and the whole idea is that in the Lord's Supper is that this is to be representative of the whole of our faith and our stance of that we are distinct in what we believe and who we are before God. Now, that takes on more importance when you understand, going back to chapter 8, about the use of the food offered to idols was because that served a religious purpose for them too. It was different food, but what was the whole idea that was a problem in chapter 8? They were coming out of it because thinking that if I partake of this, this associates me with that fellowship and that group of people. Now, just having that food that had been in that market and been taken from there didn't do that on its own. But he's wanting to get down here to the heart of things to make sure you understand that there is an important distinction here. That we do not belong with this. Just because that we can eat that food does not make us part with them, and that that's okay in that association. Why? Because this is our people. And that is what we're expressing in the Lord's Supper. This is my people. This is my Lord. This is my God. This is what I believe. This is what is core to who I am. And what we are to understand in the Lord's Supper and how we're to think through the Lord's Supper, we should be every week reviewing the core elements of our faith and our identity spiritually. That's what it is doing. It's our trust in what Jesus came to do in taking on flesh, having a body, having blood, dying sacrificially and offering that blood to provide a new covenant by which we can live and be in fellowship with God through what He did. Didn't I just walk you through everything Jesus said to them? Okay? That's at the core of it, and that's what we are drawn back to, okay? So that's the tie-in. The beginning then, the beginning at baptism, then the core elements of our identity and who we are as God's people in this spiritual food and spiritual drink. And then he specifically, though, saying, when they drank, and this is going to come back later on in the text, that they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. The emphasis here is on you need to know who actually was providing this. This was not a magical rock. Now, the key element when you say this, when it says that spiritual rock that followed them. Now, which is interesting because how many times did God provide water from a rock? Twice. The second time gets Moses into trouble because he strikes it instead of speaking to it, and that's why he's not allowed to go into Canaan. But in both instances, he did that. Those were years apart, right? So You have the idea of, can you just, if you're taking this literally, I want you to imagine a couple of million Israelites walking along. There's the cloudy pillar, truly, literally, in front of them. And in the rear guard, there's this big rock, and it's just following. Is that what? Yeah, I know. If you're not smiling at that thought, then you think, what's Kevin doing? I was doing some review for this. According to Linsky, there was a Jewish writing, and you'll get some, when you go back into the pseudepigrapha, you're going to get some wild things out of the Jews. But their interpretation of this was somewhat like that. There was one take on it that was like that. And the point here is it's not substantiating that idea. His point is, spiritually, who you needed with you was not a magic rock. It was Christ. Now he updates it. It was the Lord, which if you remember early on, it was the angel of God. Now, the Jews, we'll have to get to this, I think, next chapter. The Jews' ideas about angelology are off the rails. Okay? They had some, they just go into great fiction, and some are picking that up, unfortunately, today and not recognizing the difference. But in trying to reinterpret the Old Testament from the, say, 1st century BC Pharisaical point of view. If anything I don't want to be is following the doctrine of the way the Pharisees thought around the time Jesus came. Okay, that seems like an obvious losing proposition. The reason why, though, is that they had trouble understanding as they came out of captivity, putting polytheism behind them for good. Now they were struggling to try to figure out who this angel of the Lord was. And so that's where you end up with the idea of a great angel, but not God. And this is what the writer of Hebrews addresses in Hebrews 1. Okay. It also appears, an idea likely in Colossians as well, in the first 2 chapters. So you see some of those ideas. Okay. It's Christ. He's identifying Christ as the one who's doing the providing, and therefore he's identifying Christ with the Lord. That's the most important part here. He is God. He is the one with whom you had covenant. And he is the one with whom you have covenant today. In the same way that they had covenant with him then, you have covenant with him today. He died to make that covenant possible under the new covenant. But then we get to verse 5, and this is the transition. But with most of them, God was not well pleased. It's the same idea. He was displeased. What should he have been? The whole reason to do this is, after he had done all of this, wouldn't you think you would have been pretty happy to do whatever God said? That does not describe these people at all. They were complaining at every step of the way. They'd already seen 10 plagues. They'd seen the Red Sea parted. They'd seen him turn bitter waters into good drinking water. He'd provided quail and manna for years. He'd provided water from a rock. He provided them victory in battle when they'd never been trained. And and throughout this time, they're always complaining. Most of them, he was not well pleased. How many pleased him? Well, 2 spies. 2 spies, and because the generation didn't listen to him, everybody else dies. Now, that doesn't mean that they were all lost entirely, but they suffered the consequences of it. Moses made a mistake, and he suffered a consequence because of it too. But he's talking about the most. Now, remember what I said? Most. God had done all this stuff for all these people, most of them, didn't matter to them. Why? For their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. That's not the reason why he was displeased. It's because they displeased him. That's what the consequence was. They died in the wilderness. They did not get to enjoy going into the promised land. Now, that there is an important parallel that he is establishing here. It's very similar to what the writer of Hebrews does. So he has established in these first 5 verses essentially a type-antitype relationship about the beginning of your relationship with Christ. In the same way they had a relationship with Moses, they began at baptism. Theirs was a figurative, ours is literal. They had literal food and drink provided. We have a meal that is provided for a different purpose in a different way, that is our identity. And they had the one who was looking after them and providing them, and that was Christ. And he is still the one that we have today. So he is setting all this up in terms of identity to understand, remembering going back to the very beginning of the text about the hour, of that this is what makes them our fathers too. Is that in principle, in all these basic ways, they had key components that we are to look at, because, as he's going to say in verse 11, that way they can serve as an example. Because it is tied enough to what he wants from us that we can see the parallels, which is key to understanding what an example is to recognize the parallel, to follow through on the parallel, and to learn the lesson that they missed because of the parallels. So we will pick up there in verse 6 in 3 weeks from today. Sorry, gospel meetings.